to see so much interest in this topic. Today is a big day for India. From a polling station in the Himalayas to the Indian Ocean, over 44 days, 970 million people have voted. The purpose of this convening is to discuss the results, understand their implications, and offer some clarity on trends. And to introduce our speakers, Rithika Kumar is a postdoctoral fellow at Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame. And beginning July, she will be an assistant professor of political science at Rice University. Prashant is a Washington, D.C.-based U.S. correspondent of the Hindustan Times. And Prashant has earlier served as the national political editor and bureau chief of the paper. He's the author of How the BJP Wins Inside India's Greatest Election Machine, which is very relevant to us today. Dhruva Jaishankar is the executive director of Observer Research Foundation America, which he helped establish in 2020. We'll have a few moderated questions, and then we'll break to audience questions, and I'll indicate when we're close to that so that you can have your questions ready. Prashant, I'm going to start with you. Could you give our audience a quick summary of the party configurations as it stands today, for example, the NDA alliances?
So the National Democratic Alliance, which has been the ruling alliance for the last 10 years, is led by the BJP, of course. Till now, the BJP has not needed the support of the allies to get to the majority mark. But after today, the BJP does need the support of allies. Among the critical allies of the BJP who will play a role in government formation is the Telugu Desam Party, which is based in Andhra Pradesh, led by Chandrababu Naidu, who often tells interlocutors that he is the senior most chief minister around, who he became the chief minister in the early 90s, even before Modi had become chief minister. And he has also won his state assembly results. The other big ally for the BJP this time is going to be Nitish Kumar of the Janata Dal United. He is the chief minister of Bihar. He has made 5 to 6 switches in the last 10 years, shifting from one camp to the other, so don't bother tracking where he is and how he has landed up in the BJP right now with the BJP, but he's going to play a very important role as well. And there are a few smaller parties, one from Bihar again, which is a Dalit party, a couple of parties, factions from Maharashtra. So that's broadly the National Democratic Alliance. And then on the other side, you have the India Alliance, which is the alliance led by the Congress. This is the alliance which has done surprisingly well today. Put together, they have, I think, 235 seats in the House of 543. And the Congress itself, I think, has got 200 seats the last time I had checked, 98 to 100. I don't know whether it finally landed at 100, but that includes, it did, right? And that includes a bunch of smaller regional parties which have all done reasonably well. The Samajwadi Party in particular is one of the biggest regional parties in Uttar Pradesh, and the big story of this election, among other states, and we'll come to that later, is UP, where the BJP faced a big setback at the hands of the Samajwadi Party Congress alliance. But there are other formations as well, including Mamata Banerjee's Trinamool Congress in West Bengal, again a state where the BJP was not able to do well. In Maharashtra, this alliance has 2 parties, Shiv Sena and the Nationalist Congress Party, led by veteran leaders Uddhav Thackeray and Sharad Pawar. So, and then there are a bunch of southern parties which are a part of this alliance, including Tamil Nadu's ruling party. So I think that should give you a sense of the two broad formations.
Thank you. To Rithika and Prashant, how do you think the BJP has fared in newer geographies, in areas where they're usually dominant? As the polls were rolling in, were you surprised, or was it as expected?
I must confess, I was surprised. I had thought that the BJP would be able to get a majority on its own. Look, this is also because the very definition of success has got redefined in the last 10 years. If BJP had got the number that it got today, in 2014, it would have been considered a triumph. But because BJP got a single party majority on its own, after 30 years, remember Indian politics was marked by a coalition era between 1989 and 2014, and BJP redefined that by getting 282 seats on its own. And in 2019, it was able to get 303 seats. And so when the Prime Minister launched the campaign this time around, he said that the BJP would get 370 seats on its own. It had 303 seats. It needed 272 seats, and it landed up with 240 seats. So if you look at it with that yardstick in mind, it has not fared as well as it would have liked. And this is a setback. But if you look at it within the wider arc of how Indian democracy has evolved, this is still a remarkable achievement, because do remember, this is after 10 years of being in power. And the only other Prime Minister who has returned to power for the third consecutive time is Jawaharlal Nehru in 1962. And Nehru did not complete that third term in office because he died in 1964. And there is a high possibility that Prime Minister Modi will complete the third term in office, and he'll become the first Prime Minister actually to complete 3 full elected terms in office, because Nehru's first 4 years were before the constitution was drafted and elections were held. So in itself an achievement, but given the standards they had set, a setback. Setback in states where they had been dominant, which is primarily in North and West India. 3 or 4 states which I earlier referred to, Uttar Pradesh where they didn't do very well, Maharashtra they didn't do very well, but rapid expansion, dramatic expansion in states across India's east coast, particularly Odisha, where they are forming the state government for the first time, and they won 20 on 21 Lok Sabha seats. Telangana, a southern state where they have done well again, and Andhra Pradesh where they are now in an alliance. So I think it's a mixed story of setbacks in some areas and gains in others.
Yeah, I think my comments are going to kind of follow along on Prashant's comments. And broadly, yeah, for me as well, it was, I think it was surprising, particularly given just 2 days ago, what the exit polls were saying and predicting a clear, triumph kind of for the BJP and the NDA. So given that context and given the context of the campaign and how kind of one-sided it has been, particularly with respect to resources that have been put in, as the data suggests, and a broader kind of narrative of a lack of opposition, right? So keeping that context in mind, the results are most definitely surprising, and particularly going to the question on strongholds versus new areas, and I think Prashant answered that really well. And what I think these results suggest is that there's kind of a flip in how we think of the North and South divide in this election, where you have certain strongholds like in Uttar Pradesh, like actually flipping and going to the opposition, while the BJP has made inroads in the South. So yeah, that's what I'd say. Thanks.
Moving on to a slightly abstract question, so anybody who has a pulse, feel free to answer it. How aware are voters of the India Alliance, as it is called, and with the intent that it was supposed to create a pan-India sentiment?
The India Alliance comprises of formations which are active political formations in a particular geography, and so the voters are voting for that party and that party's symbol in that election. So when the voter is in Uttar Pradesh is voting, the voter is not voting for an India Alliance symbol. The voter is voting for the Samajwadi Party or the Congress, and these are formations that they are very familiar with. And I think the spread of mass media, the fact that news, information, opinion, a lot of rubbish is consumed 24/7 on geo-provided networks and data to people all across the country, gives them adequate information of what's going on. So even if they don't have a very coherent sense of the exact configuration of the alliance, I think they have a pretty good sense that BJP is on one side and these parties are on the other.
Yeah, I think, again, following along these lines. And I do think that to some extent, the India Alliance in whatever way, tried to put up a certain narrative, particularly by honing in or like really doubling down on this aspect of this cleavage of caste. And that narrative, I believe, has, stuck. This is all conjecture at this point, and coming from, what I'm reading of reporting from a lot of these contexts. So in that sense, I think the India Alliance seemed to have created some kind of counter narrative, and it perhaps also helped that the BJP itself did not have a national level narrative this time around. So yeah.
Switching gears from the parties to the voters themselves. Rithika, you wrote a piece about increasing female voter turnout, but on looking more closely, it's not as rosy as it seems. And you talk about independent voting behavior. I'd like to ask you to elaborate on that, as well as talk about if political parties today are really focused on issues that women care about, or are there some misconceptions?
Yeah, so, one of the big stories which seem to have come out of this election, which I believe has been in the making for a while, is the rising female turnout in India, right? So in 2019, women surpassed men in the rates at which they were turning out to vote. So that was incredible, and it's an increase that we've been observing particularly since 2009 for a host of reasons, and it's hard to really pinpoint on one, but there have been considerable kind of efforts made by the ECI to push voting and voter turnout among the marginalized, population, including women. And of course, there is this aspect that women themselves are empowered as education among women increases, and women participate in the labor force, and fertility reduces. So all of that eventually also comes across and plays out in the political sphere. So that's one important aspect that's been happening. And I tried to look up this year's numbers. I don't know if it's, maybe Prashant might know. I feel like it's women haven't really surpassed men. I think they are short of 0.03 percentage points or something. So, but still, at par with men, and in many constituencies, I believe they have turned out in larger numbers than men. Now, yes, there are a lot of aspects. This is a very macro level idea of, and our understanding of women's, political participation, when there's a lot more to it. And one aspect is that of how much autonomy do women actually exercise in making their vote choice. So women do exercise a considerable amount of autonomy, that is for sure. One way in which they differ from men is that is in the extent to which they rely on their spouses to make that decision. And still the number of women who say, or the proportion of women who say that they're voting on their own remains higher than the ones who say that they rely on their spouse. So that's where this idea of autonomy of vote choice comes from. And even in my own research and conversations with women, a lot of them will tell me eventually, I'm going to listen to everybody, what they tell me, but once I go in there and cast my ballot, it's my decision. So it's a very interesting idea, and more needs to be done to understand this. And coming to this aspect of how parties are in particular reacting, I think parties definitely are taking notice, and the host of campaign promises or even welfare benefits that have been carried out in the past couple of years, or what they propose to do, be it direct cash transfers to women, free cylinders, or even water provision, right? So which is a very gendered kind of service that exists. So in that sense, yes, parties are taking notice, but it's very confined to seeing women as belonging and or in their identity within the household, whereas in my own research I've seen that when you ask women how many what are the top issues that you care about, or that are in your life, right, what do you see, they actually say water is an issue as often as employment. So also thinking of women as individuals beyond the household and creating that identity. I think that's something that parties might need to consider more going forward. Yeah.
Speaking of welfare, which I think has been an important part of the conversation around this election, how do you think digital public infrastructure and last mile welfare delivery has played into this election? And does the average voter think about the last 10 years or 15 years, or do they think about just the last term when it comes to welfare?
I think you have to see it, and I think voters do see it as a 10-year project, because the entire digital public infrastructure interface, as far as it applies to welfare, relies on the opening of bank accounts, and financial inclusion, the mobile phone, and then the unique identity card, which is Aadhaar, the number. And that has enabled the government to dramatically improve the delivery capabilities of the Indian state. And do note that the delivery capabilities of the Indian state were leaky, filled with corruption through intermediaries. And I think that is going to be one of the abiding legacies of this government and Prime Minister Modi. This has resulted in a very vast net of welfare, which it has entailed cash transfers to farmers, it has entailed cash transfers for construction of rural homes, it has entailed toilet construction, it has entailed the distribution of gas cylinders, it has resulted in provision of water. So I think there is a lot there. But the thing with welfare, I think, is that it's never enough. And of course, and I must mention the provision of free food ration since the pandemic to 800 million people. Now, all of this tells you that the government has done well, but it also tells you that hundreds of millions of people in India need all of this. And when they need all of this, the next thing that they ask for are jobs, and jobs in the formal sector, organized sector jobs with stable pay. And I think that has been the challenge this time around, where people have appreciated the dramatic improvement in the welfare architecture. They want more. Other parties are, catching up to this and therefore offering more and more welfare promises. But the aspiration of the voter is now gone beyond that, where they want all of this, but in addition, they want jobs, and that's a puzzle that nobody has been able to solve.
Yeah, I also agree that, just building of this digital infrastructure, which is really commendable, has led to this form of welfare service provision that we've seen in the recent past. So that has also created this ability for parties, particularly the BJP, to create this or capture the consciousness, right? Like the political consciousness, even of the most definitely of the rural voter, and particularly women, because a lot of these services kind of were directed to women. And when you go and talk to them, many of them identify, Modi. They might not identify their chief minister or their, village leader, but many people know Modi. So that has definitely captured the consciousness. And as I was saying, and as Prashant was also saying, I think that the voter now needs more. Even women are thinking about jobs and employment, and this also comes at a time when there's a rapidly, I think now it's stagnated, but there was a falling female labor force participation, right? So, and there has been research which suggests that it's kind of maybe a supply side problem more than a demand side problem. So so now that this welfare is being provided and people recognize that, but I think we're also still a poor country that is fairly unemployed. There's high levels of unemployment, and there's a need for that, which voters have, I think, shown they need this time. Yeah.
Coming to Prime Minister Modi's participation on the global stage with the state visit here with the G20, how much does the average voter think about the candidate versus the Prime Minister Modi image? And do you think foreign policy factors into this election? Dhruva, if you could.
Thanks. There was a lot of commentary to that effect, right? Which I saw, amongst other people, Milind Vaishnav and others wrote about this, which is that foreign policy matters in this election in a way that it doesn't, hasn't in the past. I mean, I haven't seen too much evidence to support that. There's been some anecdotal, when people are asked by journalists in media, why are you voting for Prime Minister Modi? Why are you voting for the BJP? One of the answers that you sometimes hear is he's elevated India's position on the international stage. But I was looking at polling data. This is pre-poll data that CSDS put together. And it's interesting that only about a third of voters appeared familiar with the G20 summit that India hosted last year. Now, we don't have any comparative data, so it could be that, compared to past summits or past events like this, it was, gone up from 10% to 1/3, and that would be quite a significant achievement. Of those, about 1/3, 1/4 of total, that meaning about 25% of total respondents viewed this positively. So they saw this about something like it was roughly about 8% or so said that this was either political posturing or this was a waste of money, public money, and stuff like that. So all of that again, it says that this does seem to resonate with some. You could still say if it resonates positively with 1/4 of voters, that's still perhaps more than at times. And generally, ORF, our partners in Delhi, they do an annual survey of Indians under 35 and their views on world affairs. And that's pretty consistent with polls about international affairs generally, where Indians on many issues don't have very strong views. They would like India to play a bigger role. They have a very strong sense of India as an aspirational power. They have very strong positive views of the US, of Russia, of Quad countries. They have very negative views of Pakistan. China somewhere in the middle. It's gone a bit more negative in the last few years. But barring those issues, they don't really have very strong opinions about lots of things. We get very high rates of, when you do public surveys, very high rates of I don't know or I don't have an opinion. So the long and short of it is they does seem to have played some role, but how much we'll really have to see.
I have one more question before I turn it to the audience, and this is for all three of you. Imagine a split screen of global or Western media on one side and on the other side, Indian media. What narratives have stood out to you in terms of election coverage, not just yesterday and today, but over the last 44 days?
The Western media should introspect today. For the last 44 days, all we have heard is how Indian institutions are terrible, Indian democracy is in crisis, Indian voters have been taken for a ride, Modi is a despot. Now, if all of this was true, and I'm not an apologist for the government, I'm not a part of the government, and I have a lot of critique of Modi's social agenda and ideological worldview. But the point is, if all of this was true, this is not the result we would have been seeing. So clearly there was something going on the ground which shows to you the robustness of political competition, bottom-up political competition in India, which I think the Western media, and to be fair, a large part of the Indian media, including the exit polls, missed. So I think there are important issues that the Western media covers, but I think there are critical gaps because the Western media has concluded that this is a despotic leader and this is a fascist party. And, I think the effort to understand the sources of strength of the BJP, which go beyond the bigotry, and bigotry is an element of it, by the way, I think is limited. And I hope that today it's a lesson for, I think, exit pollsters in India. It is a lesson for a lot of our own media, domestic media. But I hope it's a lesson for the Western media also, that this is a remarkably diverse country. It is a large country. It has multiple social contradictions. It has multiple political threads and currents. And the robustness of democracy and the resilience of democracy in India is on display today.
Yeah, I think that for me, yes, the West has been fairly critical. The Western media has been fairly critical of Modi and Indian democracy, and there's definitely some element of it that could validate that point. And I agree that it kind of did not really pay attention or hasn't given due attention to the fact that even during, the last 10 years, the BJP continued to lose in state elections, and that itself was an important kind of point of how vibrant and competitive state level elections and democracy in India can be, right? So that's one aspect, and actually for me it was I was really interested in the work that a lot of alternate, I shouldn't say alternate, but not very mainstream media outfits were doing, and the work they were doing in trying to bring into provide importance to a lot of stories that mainstream media had not paid attention to, and the fact that it had created things, YouTube had become like a space where a lot of young people were consuming information. So all of these spaces, providing some area of dissent, or providing spaces for stories that are not covered by the mainstream media to come up. So that was an interesting, development that I kind of, paid more attention to in this campaign season. So, yeah.
I just sort of three somewhat disaggregated thoughts. So one is, I think sometimes you just have to take a step back and marvel at, this is a year of elections. We'll have elections, or we've already had, or we will have in, Pakistan, UK, European Parliament, South Africa, Indonesia, Mexico, the United States, obviously. And in the midst of all of that, I think just something stand out about the Indian election, right? I mean, we had 650 million votes cast. I mean, that's just a massive amount. 1 out of 12 human beings participated directly in this election. I mean, that's just remarkable. You have 42 parties that were likely to be represented in the parliament when it takes seat. I mean, that's, again, sort of significant. When you tell people that in a largely two-party state like the United States, it's sort of mind-blowing. And then just the ability of the Indian voter to surprise, right? I mean, I was telling Prashant earlier, every election I can recall since 1999, the last 6 elections, general elections, have surprised in some way over pre-poll expectations. And the challenge is we don't know in which way it will surprise, but one thing that seems to be a constant is the ability of the Indian voter to surprise us. So I think the Indian election just stands out remarkably for these reasons. Second, just in terms of media coverage, I think there was a lot of the takeaway was the exit polls and the mainstream media in India was discredited. But I think if you go past some of the loud talk shows on television, there was actually a fair amount of very good granular analysis, and I'm not saying just because Prashant, but Hindustan Times had, and actually we have some contributors here for that, did some great coverage over the past few months of various aspects of the election. And again, some of it was not even the big media companies, but some online media, granular reporting from every one of Indian states. And it took, it's not always easy to access, and particularly for people who don't follow Indian politics on a day-to-day basis. But there was an amazing amount of good quality reporting from the ground, which now, in hindsight, we can look back on, and it picked up various trends. Obviously, the pollsters have not done particularly well. But all I'm saying is, amidst all the misinformation on social media, and there was a great deal of misinformation, amidst a lot of the noise of mainstream media and particularly television media, there was a fair amount of really good coverage, whether it was an analysis or reporting from the ground. The last thing is, I just, one of the things to look back on is an ability, people are going to put interpretations on the poll results. And it reminds me a little bit, some of you are from India or have been there. You never ask, when you go to a town and you ask somebody for directions, and they clearly don't know the directions to a place, but they still tell you anyway. And that's really how all analysis is currently. We're all in some village in the middle of India asking for directions. And so anybody who tells you they know exactly what went wrong or for the BJP or what went right for another party or something doesn't really know what they're talking about. So I just sort of want to warn about over-interpreting some of the details. And many people, again, if we look back on the last few elections, we also know in hindsight that people have taken the wrong lessons from electoral defeats. They've over-interpreted mandates. Or, just the last sort of note of warning, which is I think analysts both inside and outside of India will offer interpretations, to take them with a grain of salt. Things that will now assume hindsight inevitability were not clear at the time. And also sometimes we all suffer from confirmation bias, right? So things we want to believe were the reason, we will find reasons to interpret things in a certain way. So all of this is to say, I think, for any analyst of politics or any student of politics to approach this with a little bit of humility.
Thank you. If you could raise your hand and I call on questions. Back there. In the check black shirt. Oh.
Thank you for the interesting discussion. So my question was, what's your take on the ethnic angle to the elections on two axes? One is the caste angle, because the opposition was saying they would institute a caste census, increase reservations, affirmative action. And the other thing is, we saw in the last general election or the West Bengal state elections how Mamata Banerjee was able to use the concept of these are outsiders, not Bengalis, this sort of concept, especially when it's seen that the BJP is currently being run from a Gujarati or like that perspective. So do you think these angles played any role in the election? I know it's a bit premature, but what are your thoughts?
You know, I don't think the second factor played as much of a role because it is a national election, and in the state specific context of West Bengal, she may have been able to use that to some extent, and also because of the paucity of a strong local leadership pool that the BJP is still in the process of cultivating in Bengal. But I think in this election, given that Modi, who has been a chief minister of Gujarat, has won 2 national elections across different states, and even in this election, it is largely due to his appeal that the BJP has expanded in states in the east and the south. I think I would suggest that the second dimension may not be very important, but the first is critically important. And I think this has to be understood in the context of this broader battle that has been going on for the last 3 decades or even longer within mainstream Indian politics, between the construction of a unified Hindu political identity versus the assertion of disaggregated Hindu caste identities. So for most part, the politics of secularism, the electoral dimension of the politics of secularism in India rested on weaving together electoral coalitions of a set of Hindu subaltern castes, some dominant castes, with as large consolidated a block of Muslims as you could get. And that then became the staple of success for some of the social justice parties, as they were called in Bihar and UP, which represented backward groups, as also for the Congress. And I think what the BJP attempted to do over the last 3 decades, but most successfully over the past decade, is the construction of a unified Hindu political identity. Now, the problem for the BJP was that its leadership, its organizational base, its membership was largely upper caste. And therefore, the immediate reaction of backward groups, of Dalits, of tribals, was that, you know, this Hindu identity is a cover for upper caste domination. And the political genius of Narendra Modi rested in the fact that he constructed what I call inclusive Hindutva. And the party's character changed. Modi himself comes from a backward community. There was a rapid expansion of the BJP among OBCs and among Dalits. In the last 2 elections, and this has changed in this election, but BJP had the highest number of the Dalit MPs and the highest number of the Dalit votes, the highest number of tribal MPs. So the caricature of BJP as an upper caste party no longer held. Now, to challenge this, what the opposition did was reassert the primacy of caste by picking up the issues that you just outlined, which was caste census, which was demand for proportionate representation for all caste groups. And I think that had traction. And they also suggested to voters that the BJP's desire for 400 seats, a massive majority on its own, was intended to change the constitution and scrap the architecture of affirmative action for Hindu subaltern groups. Now, this was false, but it was a message that went down to the ground. To counter it, what the BJP did was, put forth another false premise, which was that the opposition, if they got elected, would snatch away the affirmative action provisions from Hindu subaltern groups and give it to Muslims. So BJP's unified Hindu political identity is framed in opposition to Muslims. The opposition's disaggregated caste politics is framed in opposition to the upper castes. And I think we saw that tension play out, and this tension will continue to play out in Indian society. This election has not given a decisive final answer. This is work in progress. In many pockets, Dalits, tribals, backwards continued to vote for BJP. In many pockets, including in critical states like Uttar Pradesh, I think we have seen a drift away from the BJP of these groups because of either the promises that were made or because of the fear that affirmative action will be taken away.
Satvik.
Hello, everyone. Busy day. So I guess right now what we're seeing in a situation is it's Prime Minister Modi's first time ever really dealing with a coalition government, either in his time in Gujarat or in his time at the center. So this will be kind of almost new untread ground for him as a leader. In the actual election, in the actual elections between the partners of the BJP, the TDP and the JDU, the sensitivities of coalition politics will start to rise again. What would you say are the specific sensitivities that a new NDA government will have to pay attention to, especially the BJP, that it may face challenges with in order to stay in power?
I think, yes, the fact that the BJP did not get, a majority and has to rely on regional parties is going to mean that the BJP we see in 2024 is going to be very different from the BJP of 2019. And I think there are a couple of things which I think they might, that might be hard for them to do, which they have, been saying they want to do, which, one of them is the one India, one nation, one election. So that's one aspect which can, I think, have roadblocks to the BJP's ability to kind of do that. Then the other thing is, sorry, what? Yeah, uniform, civil code. So there are these like different aspects which I think that the BJP will find hard to just, outright kind of implement in the absence of a majority. And in that sense, the regional parties and its coalition like actors will, and also the opposition, just given, the sheer force of it, will mean that Parliament will, there'll be like more lively debate in Parliament going forward. But yeah, I don't know what the others have to say.
I think we'll know a lot more if we were to hold this event 24 hours from now. I think we know a little bit more because the NDA, the coalition is meeting tomorrow. And I think that's where some of the bartering over cabinet positions will take place. Just 4 quick points on that. So one is obviously the cabinet will have to make space for coalition allies, particularly I'd say 4, there may be others as well, but particularly the TDP, JDU, Shiv Sena, LJP will be sort of 4 who got significant seats and are needed to maintain the majority. Second, actually one thing is fortunes within the BJP will also rise and fall based on the results, right? So there were, even within the BJP, there were some winners and losers, some who actually lost their seat and will need to be replaced, but some, in other cases, some states that did well, some states that did badly and need to be represented. 3, I would note that the BJP has been in coalitions before, not pre-Modi, Modi's leadership. So, between 1998 and 2004, the BJP did lead a sort of more motley coalition government and had a sort of had to work with those partners. And then the last thing is, Modi has worked, since becoming prime minister with at the state level, the BJP has struck alliances, not always successfully. So they've been, but in whether it's Jammu and Kashmir and Maharashtra and other places, the BJP has worked with alliances. So I think if you look at all of those things, you can see some patterns. But yes, in some cases, in some ways, we're in slightly different territory.
All I'll just add to that is that before Modi is anything else, he's a Gujarati. And Gujaratis are ruthless pragmatists. And I think he will adapt, he will retreat when he has to, and he will assert when he has to.
The third row on the left from the front, I think there are 2 questions there. Maybe we can take both.
So I'm curious to know, why are is India never holding any primary election? We never hold any primaries. And also, if Modi's critics are talking about his bad things, then why haven't they named the opposition leader? I've never heard anybody say Mallikarjun Kharge. Never ever heard anybody who's a Modi critic say his name. So why do you think that is as well?
Go ahead.
My question to Prashant, always great to hear from you. Since you're part of the media fraternity, I would like to know how do you explain the wide chasm between the exit polls versus the reality? I mean, of course, India is a big democratic exercise, it always happens, but this time particularly, there was maybe one poll which even got remotely close to what the actual results were, Dainik Bhaskar. Apart from that, it was all over the place. Medha, with your permission, I have a question for Dhruva as well.
Sure.
Dhruva, on the subject of minority parties within the government, the four parties you named, they in total contribute about 36, 37 seats, if I'm not wrong. And that also happens to be the same number of seats that the Samajwadi Party is, which is the second largest party in India Alliance. Do you believe that if the smaller parties choose to work in the India Alliance instead, they would have a larger space to exert themselves politically as opposed to working with a larger partner?
So I'll take your question on Mallikarjun Kharge. I think he's a name that you hear a lot within the Indian political discourse now. He is the president of the Congress party. He is a veteran politician from Karnataka who has been minister at the center. He is a Dalit leader. And to give him credit, when he was when he was elected and he fought in an election against Shashi Tharoor and won with the support of the Nehru Gandhi family, everybody underestimated him. And to be fair, I think he has done a pretty good job, because there is a division of labor in the Congress party at the moment where Rahul Gandhi is this ideologue in chief doing his campaigns and yatras, and Kharge is doing a lot of the housekeeping and internal party management and stitching of alliances. So I think if the India Alliance had got a majority on its own, Kharge would have been a very strong contender to be a prime minister. So I think, sorry. So, I mean, I don't know which media critics you're talking about. Maybe Western media critics are not that, but that's not something that I'll be able to give you a sense of. But I know that within India, he's somebody who is known. On the primaries, I think it's just a difference in the nature of the party system that you have here and the party system that you have there. Tickets are given, people join parties, they're recruited, they rise up the ladder in different ways in India. There is, of course, patronage that the party bosses have and exercise in the distribution of tickets, but there is also a lot of bottom-up work that political workers do before they end up getting a ticket to the parliamentary elections. So I think it's just a different system. Sorry, I think you had a question on the exit polls. So again, I'm very glad that I'm not a pollster and I'm not accountable for all the failures of exit pollsters here. And I'll tell you honestly, I don't have a sense of why everybody got it wrong. Usually, even though the numbers are off by a few seats here and there, if all exit polls suggest a particular direction, they usually get it right. Or they have in the last election they did. They underestimated BJP, but they got the overall direction right. I think they will all go back to the drawing board and see what went wrong. And I don't have any conspiracy theory on this, especially when it comes to some of the more credible pollsters, which is the Axis India Today poll as well as the C Voter. These are two I would look for. There are many which are sponsored by parties, but these are the two I would. And CSDS, of course, which doesn't do seat conversion, but it does vote share and it asks different sets of questions. One thing I would add, though, is that it's very difficult in India to do vote to seat conversion. With 37% of the vote last time, BJP got 303 seats. With almost 40%, I think this time. It's 36.5 they've got. So just with distinction of the 1 percentage point, they've come down by 60 seats. Right, and so this conversion is very hard for pollsters also to
do. It's interesting that I think the Communist Party of India, Marxists, got 13 million votes. The BSP got 2% of votes, got 0 seats. I mean, like, so again, just to feed in, like, so the BSP got more seats, more votes overall than the DMK. The DMK has 22 seats in Parliament. BSP has 0, right? So it just tells you how hard some of this is.
I just have a two-finger on just the polling. We also don't really know much about the sample. I mean, maybe Prashant has more to say, but like there's really no idea like whom they're sampling, or like it's really not that transparent to kind of, even understand like what demographic it is. And because another thing that's come out of this election is also the urban-rural, divide, which has created heterogeneity or differences among even like BJP voters, right? So so overall, like just, not much information is also available about how these polls are conducted.
Just quickly on the question. I mean, look, I can't decide. These are decisions that are in Chandrababu Naidu's head and Nitish Kumar's head. I mean, I mean, my understanding is they've already indicated, at least going by press reports, that they're going to support the BJP. They're planning on attending the meeting tomorrow. One of the things, I mean, just going back to the coalition era, 2004 to 2014, one of the things we saw is some of the smaller parties actually like to be in power. And so for them, they'll try to extract as much and negotiate as much, but they don't actually, once they're in, they don't actually want to lose that privileged position. And so, I remember in 2004 and after 2009, people saying, oh, this is going to be very fragile coalitions. There'll be another election. This won't be a government that will see out the full 5 years. And yet, in both cases, it did happen. So, I mean, there are those kinds of considerations that you can still be, with 40, I mean, collectively the 4 parties have 40 seats, I believe, in sort of thereabouts, that they will have more bargaining power with the BJP, with one, because they matter, than in this very fractured coalition, of alliance of 20 parties where the distribution is more even. So again, somebody could do a very complicated game theory exercise as to and bargaining amongst these coalitions, but just going by recent history, there does seem to be a desire to be, even with relatively small number of seats, to be a kingmaker in a ruling coalition as opposed to the risk of being in opposition.
Yeah, question in the back there.
Hi. My question is that in India, at this point, there has been a competition between states to attract foreign direct investment. And now Chandrababu Naidu in his previous tenure was a big proponent of investment in bringing investment into Andhra Pradesh. Now that Chandrababu Naidu and TDP has got this power to make or break the government, how do you think that this negotiation power will be used by the TDP government with the center to help them attract more investment into Andhra Pradesh? And I have a second question for Prashant. How do you anticipate this coalition government affecting the delimitation exercise that is due in 2026? Thank you.
There is redistricting, I think, that happens here after a census, right? In India, seats in the Lok Sabha, which is the elected house of the people, has not been delimited for the last 50 years, slightly more than 50 years now. And the deadline for delimitation is 2026. I mean, that's when the process will begin. And so there are various steps to it. The first is that India has not held a census in this decade. So we will need to hold a census. This is, by the way, a blot, because we've held censuses very regularly before this. And then there will be a reproportioning of the number of seats that every state gets. Now, the debate here is between largely the north and the south. There is an east and west, and there are very various dimensions to it. But southern states, which have done well on fertility and population control, believe that their representation based on population will go down, and the proportion of representation of the northern states, if population is the only criteria, will go up. And there is already resentment in parts of the south about how they have to end up paying and cross-subsidizing northern states because they are the more developed kind of regions. So this is going to be a very sensitive, very difficult debate that India will enter into. But where I see hope is the fact that the BJP today is a party that is invested in expanding in the south. If BJP was a party that was only in the north and was not interested in the south, then it was more likely to take a deeply partisan, parochial, North Indian kind of perspective to this debate. But I don't think the BJP will do that. The Prime Minister has already said that there should be justice, and he has in fact critiqued Rahul Gandhi on this question, because one of Gandhi's claims is that there should be the reservation based on population. And he has used that to say, what about the South then? Which is a sign that the Prime Minister is signaling to the South that, look, I'm going to be sensitive on this question. It's not only the BJP. This is a process that will involve various stakeholders. And you will, I think, see a lot of very contentious debates on it. But I think eventually there will be some kind of, some kind of mutually agreed upon arrangement.
I mean, so the question, I'm not sure, it's too early to say, look, we just had the results today, how individuals will affect policy. But there was, I think, an expectation that there would be a big push towards manufacturing and attracting FDI in manufacturing, particularly in certain sectors of manufacturing over the coming years. And there's also a competitive aspect to it. I mean, any of you who've been to a sort of trade fair or something now, sees like every state has a sort of booth that says sort of come invest in our state and not the other states. So there has been that expectation, and obviously there is sometimes with big mega projects. There is a political dimension to it. People want to create jobs in their constituencies. So all of this augurs well, it would seem, for Andhra Pradesh in particular. But I think I think that would be more of a factor, that the competitive nature of investment into India will remain a factor. The fact that this is expected. The question will just be, to what degree, based on other indicators, the political considerations. We saw the stock market really go up and down today, except for a lot of volatility. Those factors, I think, will matter more per se than the fact, whether a particular party is part of the coalition or not.
I'll just add one point there, which is that Andhra Pradesh got divided 10 years ago, and Hyderabad, which is where Chandrababu Naidu got so many of his investments, is no longer in Andhra. It is Telangana, and Andhra Pradesh has been struggling to create a new capital, has been trying to get financial support and something called special status from the center, which would give it more financial assistance. So I think those would be very important points of negotiation. But in terms of FDI, I think what Dhruva said is absolutely correct.
Yeah, in the front here. If I may pivot to foreign policy a bit, I was wondering if our three panelists could address how Modi's foreign policy playbook would play out in a third term, also considering the mixed and uncertain penetration of foreign policy in this current elections discourse. Thank you.
Look, the short answer is we don't know. Sometimes personnel is policy, so I think we'll have some clarity on that in the next week or two. Maybe probably less than a week, but next 5 or 6 days. I mean, look, I see foreign policy tends to be a pretty, again, it's changed a little bit over the past few years, tends to be a pretty elite concern. And it tends, the Prime Minister, all Prime Ministers in India have had a significant sway over that. So really, at some point, the buck will stop at the Prime Minister, and it's pretty clear who that's going to be. So for these reasons, I don't see sort of major changes playing out. I think it gets more tricky when things require legislative approval or cabinet approval, and you need to bring on at that stage coalition partners and allies. But I think the broad trends, in fact, I think, in response to one congratulatory tweet just a few hours ago, Prime Minister Modi said, I think to Mauritius, he said, Mauritius is important for our Neighborhood First, our Sagar, and our Global South outreach. So the fact that he's still echoing these suggests that the broad directions will not change. I think there's some expectation. I mean, this has just been reported that if he can, he'll try and attend the G7 summit, which is taking place in a few weeks' time. All of that, again, is subject to cabinet, the formation of a cabinet very soon. So as of now, there's no indication that there'll be major changes.
Oh, Hannah?
I think just going back to the foreign policy question, externally, how should India's key partners around the world, like the US, Russia, Quad countries, France, view this election and its outcome? Like, are we going to see a policy change given the personnel changes, or should we look at other elections before that? Thank you.
They should see it as a part of very vibrant democratic tradition within India, which has thrown up this electoral mandate. I think this is going to spell, as Dhruva was indicating, continuity, especially as far as as far as the relationship with US is concerned, or with on the commitment to Quad is concerned. And India is slated to host the Quad Leaders Summit this year whenever President Biden can find the time. I think we are going to see continuity with Russia too. So I think the broad direction is probably going to be the same. I think the transitions are happening in some of these other countries right now, right? And how the domestic politics of US plays out in November is probably a more critical question, and that's what Indian policymakers will be watching, and that may indicate more rupture than what has happened in Delhi right now.
Sorry, I just add a quick thing. I mean, in some ways I maybe should have said it earlier. So just two points. One is, so I've noticed democratic leaders of different countries, they tend to partly because they're all in competitive democratic systems, they tend to assess other leaders based on their performance in elections. So you notice like respect for a leader goes up when they have a strong electoral mandate and they're more confident about dealing with them. And you see these in bilateral negotiations or multilateral negotiations, and it comes down a little bit. So there is a sense. I mean, I'm just recalling like after 2019 when Prime Minister Modi had many people surprised, got a stronger mandate. Sort of his esteem, like, wow, you got re-elected with it was reflected in engagements with other leaders. So I think the fact that he is most likely going to get another 5-year term, even if it's with a coalition, will matter because the indication will be this is someone you're going to have to work with for the next 5 years. But I also think the strength of the mandate will matter. Lastly, I won't look at this so much in terms of bilateral relations. I don't think, again, fundamentally the U.S. India's relations with the U.S. or Europe or Russia or Quad countries will change dramatically. I would just point to 3 things that I would just keep an eye out for. One is, again, investment and economic trade policy, right? So to what extent, because there is a strong domestic component to it, to what extent can and will India actually be able to leverage its external relationships to help its domestic economy, particularly in manufacturing, particularly in critical technologies. Second, I would look at what is possible in the defense realm. And again, there are a number of things that are pending. There's a sort of a committee to reform the sort of defense procurement and whether they can implement some of those reforms. There's the Agnivir scheme, which is a recruitment scheme for short-term recruitment, whether that can be seen through, whether joint theater commands and that can. So there'll be there are a bunch of pretty sweeping security policy changes that are either underway or on the anvil, and whether those can be carried forward, because again, there are very strong domestic vested interests in that. Third, I'm sticking my neck out here a little bit. In 2014, a few months after Modi's first election, China tested India on the border. In 2020, about less than a year after Modi's re-election, China tested India on the border. I would be wary and see what happens on the India-China relationship in the next year.
I think I just wanted to say that the relationship, particularly U.S.-India relations, I don't think much is going to change because of how the West sees India as kind of a counter to China. So it's still important. So that trajectory will remain, and also a lot depends. It's the ball is also in India's court in like how it's able to create and develop its manufacturing sector to provide that kind of where things can be produced and the West can kind of leverage that. So yeah, I don't think that there's going to be much change, and much depends on India too.
I think we had another question in the fourth row behind you, Amar.
Thank you. I guess turning away from the government coalition and looking more at the opposition for a second, where does the India alliance go from here? They won, obviously they won a surprising number of seats, but that doesn't necessarily match up to proportional institutional power in the Lok Sabha. In terms of maintaining the alliance, in terms of challenging the NDA, what are kind of the short, I guess, what do the next few years look like for them? Thank you.
I think that's a very good question. In the next 8 months, you're going to have 4 state elections: Maharashtra, Jharkhand, Haryana, and Delhi. In Maharashtra, the India Alliance has done well, and I would suspect that they will stick together, which is the Congress, the Uddhav Thackeray Shiv Sena, and the Sharad Pawar NCP, and they have a pretty good chance of coming to power. And Maharashtra is critical for various reasons, including the fact that Mumbai is the capital. Haryana is another state where the BJP has not done well. This is a state where Congress was in alliance with the Aam Aadmi Party, and I think that will again potentially continue with a potential setback for BJP again. In Jharkhand, we saw a sitting former chief minister of Jharkhand was arrested before the elections on corruption charges. His wife campaigned extensively, and this is another state where I would. The BJP has done reasonably well there, but I think that's a state which would be interesting to watch out. And then Delhi, again, it'll be interesting to see whether AAP and Congress continue this alliance. And then you have the 5th state, which is Bihar next November, where you have Nitish Kumar and BJP. If Nitish is stable enough to stick to one partner for a year and a half, we're going to see them together. And then on the other side, you're going to have the India Alliance, where RJD and the Congress will stick together. So I think you're going to see a set of electoral contests, and the incentives, especially given that they have performed reasonably well right now, is for the India Alliance to or constituents of this bloc to stay together. You are right that it doesn't translate into institutional power, but it changes things a little bit in Parliament. It gives them more space. It gives them an official leader of the opposition position, which the Congress has not had in the last 2 elections. It setbacks in the states will result potentially in a change in the complexion of the Rajya Sabha. So the legislative agenda for the government becomes a little more complicated than it was in the second term, where they pushed major legislative changes, be it the effective abrogation of Article 370 in Kashmir, or criminalization of triple talaq, and some of these other moves. So that becomes, I think, more complicated for the government now.
We have one at the back on the left.
Hi, I was campaign staff on the TDP's campaign in Andhra Pradesh, so it's a great day for us. I now work with a U.S. defense contractor, so the curiosity on multiple fronts. But I wanted to ask, what do you think India's adversaries are looking on to some critical sectors with a weaker Modi government that has lesser space in the parliament and thinking? What are some areas that they want to outperform the Indians in the coming years?
What kind of competitors do you mean? Sorry, just to clarify. I mean, other countries or?
Yeah, strategic competition.
So let me break down to 3 different types of competition, right? There is a global competition underway for jobs. Everybody wants jobs at home, and not just any jobs, but lucrative jobs. This is leading to, in some ways, a race towards subsidies. You've seen this in the US. It's leading to higher regulatory and in some cases tariff barriers in the EU, for example, particularly on the regulation side. So even with friendly countries, and these are largely partner countries, India is in some ways competing for this. Second, I think just more narrowly, there is a manufacturing competition underway. And in some cases, India is less in competition with the developed economies of the West and more with other emerging economies, in some cases trying to coax investment from China. In some cases, competing head-to-head with Southeast Asian economies or others, Morocco, Mexico, others who are able to. So that is underway. And again, whether India can, to what extent India can compete in what sectors will be a question going forward. The third, I would say, is really much more on the security side, right? And there, I think there are really just two competitors for India of consequence, which is China and Pakistan. And they will look to see, I think with Pakistan has its own challenges, so I don't think that, including its own political challenges. So that I think is less of a concern. I think the bigger one obviously is China. And there, I think whether India can get its act together on certain defense reforms, sort of having a more streamlined procurement system, more efficient procurement system, changing deployment recruitment patterns, changing command and control structures, things like that will be something that China will watch out for. So I would look at it in those ways. There are different sets of countries. In some cases, it's much more friendly competition, if you will. I'd say on the national security side, obviously, it's much more intense.
I think we'll take one last question here.
Hi, just to build on your point about competition with other developing economies. So what does this mean for Modi's Act East policy towards Southeast Asia in particular and ASEAN? Because if you're talking about competition for investments and jobs, then that will put many of the ASEAN countries in direct competition, because I think that's what, when we're talking about reorganization of supply chains out of China, friendshoring, reshoring, we're looking at Vietnam, we're looking at the Philippines, for example, is now coming up vis-a-vis the US interest. So I would just want to know your perspective on that. Thank you.
So three quick points there. I think sort of diplomatically, in some ways, I think we're there already with India and Southeast Asia particularly, and the Look East policy. So you have a lot more diplomatic engagement. It's much more formalized. India has an ambassador to ASEAN in Jakarta. So it takes part in most of the major summits, with the exception of APEC. So I think that will continue no matter the political dispensation. The second aspect, I think, is the military and security aspect, which has started from sort of a non-existent zero base and has now grown to something, right? So India has provided a submarine to Myanmar, does military exercises with almost every ASEAN country, provided cruise missiles for the Philippines, the Navy does more exercises and deployments east of the Malacca Straits. Also with the Quad countries, US, Japan, Australia, and such. So the military dimension has picked up, again, from a very low base, but is there. The economic side is the most complicated, partly for the reason I mentioned, which is now, and sometimes India is in direct competition with Vietnam, is in direct competition with Indonesia. And the ASEAN countries, by and large, have made a conscious decision to continue to integrate with supply chains that are linked to China. For India, this has raised a lot of concerns. And actually, the biggest problem India had with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, was that it didn't have strong enough rules of origin concerns. So China could essentially use that through third parties to increase its exports to India, which would have widened the trade deficit in China's favor. What I think essentially India's withdrawal from RCEP, or India never joined, but India's withdrawal from the negotiations was because of that. I think that doesn't mean that India will not have economic relations with Southeast Asia, and it still is underrepresented. So if you look at trade between India and ASEAN, it's not where it should be given the size of the two economies and the geographical proximity. But I think mostly it will be on a bilateral basis and on a sector-by-sector basis, rather than whole-scale, a revised FTA with ASEAN, for example. I don't see that on block. So I think in some ways the Southeast Asian countries need to there's a poll that's conducted by ICS, the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, where they look at assess, and India always does. It's picked up a little bit, but India does pretty badly in those polls. But I think partly it's just an expectation on their part, which is amongst a lot of Southeast Asian elites, there's a very narrow definition of what they want in a successful partner. They want to see investment, particularly in infrastructure. They want to see supply chain integration. They want to see sort of some security provisions, but basically not much more than that. And those are things, when you see the contrast between how much US FDI goes to Southeast Asia, how much Chinese FDI goes to Southeast Asia, there is, and you look at the perception gap, most Southeast Asians think that Chinese FDI is much significantly more. So I think that there does need to be a bit of expectation management on the part of Southeast Asia as to what India is, and what, India is a very attractive market for many of them, but they haven't been able to lean into the like labor mobility, for example.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to ask our speakers if there was one takeaway from today's discussion that you'd like to leave our audience with. What would it be about the general elections?
I would suggest that this is a complicated mandate. It will take us time to disentangle what this mandate means. But my sort of instinctive understanding of this mandate is fourfold. Politically, it is a call for a return to a more balanced and a more restrained executive. I think there were excesses that just a strong executive with a single party majority inevitably leads to. And I think India has seen that whenever it has had strong executives, other institutions get a little weaker. It's just in the nature of the interplay of forces. And I think what we are going to see is a return to a degree of balance between institutions. In terms of the economic kind of mandate, I think there is appreciation for the welfare architecture and the infrastructure leap that has happened. But I think the bottom-up signal is very clear. There is distress. There is a K-shaped recovery post the pandemic, and there is a deep, deep yearning for formal organized sector jobs. I think my third reading of the mandate is that on the social front, there is a yearning for identity-based justice, both on the caste and the religion axis, but I think a rejection of identity-based chauvinism that we saw both parties engage in, including the ruling party, where with its slightly explicit anti-Muslim propaganda, especially in the latter stages of the campaign. And I think my fourth final takeaway would be that there is a federal mandate, which again suggests that voters want a strong union government, but they want a union government that respects regional sensitivities, and there continues to be space for strong regional parties, and any arrangement in Delhi will have to take into account some of these regional aspirations. I don't think it's going to be a return to the kind of fragmented coalition era that we saw, but there is going to be more accommodation and give and take.
I think this campaign season kind of started in January with the inauguration of the temple, and will come today with the results. The BJP has not even, it kind of lost the seat where the temple is. So I think that loss, really encapsulates what this election has been, which is just that, it's been a surprise. It's a time to, sit back and kind of reflect and understand that a change in the status quo is being called for. And, going into this election, it was an election where, we knew that it's going to be a decisive one and kind of change or determine the trajectory of the country, and also establish what the voters want and what citizens want. And I think that's kind of been a clear message. The results have kind of thrown that. And going forward, I do think that, as I mentioned, that the BJP of 2024 is going to be different from the BJP of 2019, and what that means for the country, economics, the socio-cultural aspects of the country is to be seen, but it's definitely a moment of reckoning. And I think the last thing, for me, is that these results have shown that democracy in India is really alive and kicking. So, yeah.
I mean, I think I would just echo the last point, which is I think the one thing that is certain is uncertainty. And so, I think one is all of us, myself included, certain modesty when trying to predict results. And I was lucky; I did not stick my neck out and publicly predict results, which is great. So but no, I think the unpredictability of voters. I think the feeling of empowerment of voters, right? That they once you go into the booth, it's really just your decision who you vote for, and you can change your mind at the last moment. And that's something I think that's really fantastic. So anyway, so I think that would be my big takeaway.
Thank you, speakers, for trying to demystify some of this for us, and thank you all for taking the time to be here. This event will be followed by a reception in the foyer, so you're welcome to stay. Thank you.